History remembers a few rulers with the kind of fear, disgust, and morbid fascination reserved for Caligula. For centuries, his name has been a byword for tyranny, cruelty, and insanity. The stories are legendary. An emperor who made his horse a consul, who declared himself a living god, and who indulged in every twisted whim that crossed his mind. He's the ultimate symbol of absolute power corrupting absolutely. But is that the whole story? What if the Caligula we think we know is a caricature, a monster crafted by his enemies? What if the truth is far more complex and, in some ways, even more tragic? Today, we're peeling back the layers of propaganda and scandal to find the real Caligula. Was he truly a madman, or was he the victim of one of history's most successful smear campaigns? Let's dive in. To understand Caligula, we have to start with his childhood, which was anything but normal. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, was given to him by his father's soldiers. His father was the beloved general Germanicus, a Roman hero and heir apparent to the Emperor Tiberius. Caligula spent his early years in military camps, a mascot for the legions. It sounds charming, but his life was surrounded by political intrigue and danger from the very beginning. His family was at the heart of the imperial court's power struggles. After his father's sudden and suspicious death, things took a dark turn. His mother, Agrippina, the elder, and his two older brothers were arrested and eventually died in exile, victims of the paranoid Emperor Tiberius and his ruthless prefect. Imagine being a young boy, watching your entire family be destroyed by the very system you were born to lead. Caligula survived, but only by being summoned to the island of Capri, to leave with the aging, reclusive Tiberius. For years, he lived in the lion's den, walking a tightrope of survival. He had to suppress any sign of resentment or ambition, playing the part of a loyal and harmless young man. The historian Suetonius claims this is where Caligula perfected his ability to dissimulate, to hide his true feelings behind a mask. It was a brutal education in the cutthroat politics of Rome. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the throne passed to Caligula. Rome rejoiced the son of the great Germanicus was finally emperor. The dark, fearful days of Tiberius were over, or so they thought. The first few months of Caligula's reign were a golden age. He was generous and popular. He granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, pardoned political prisoners, and abolished unpopular taxes. He hosted lavish games and spectacles for the public, who adored him. It seemed like a new era of prosperity and justice had dawned. But this honeymoon period didn't last. About 7 months into his rule, Caligula fell gravely ill. He was on the brink of death, and the entire empire held its breath. When he finally recovered, something had changed. The benevolent, popular young ruler was gone. In his place was a man who seemed erratic, cruel, and increasingly This is where the infamous stories begin to pile up. Our main sources for Caligula's reign are historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both writing decades, even centuries, after his death, and they paint a chilling picture. They tell us Caligula began executing people on a whim. He forced senators to run 4 miles in front of his chariot. He squandered the Roman treasury on absurdly extravagant projects, like building a 2-mile-long floating bridge across the Bay of Baia, just so he could ride his horse across it. He engaged in scandalous affairs, including, most notoriously, with his own sisters. He wasn't just an emperor. He started demanding to be worshipped as a living god, setting up temples and statues to himself. And then there's the horse. The story that Caligula planned to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul, is perhaps the most famous tale of his madness. Incitatus lived in a marble stable, had a jewel-studded collar, and was even served oats. Mixed with gold flakes. The consul story is the ultimate symbol of his contempt for the Roman Senate and its traditions. But was it true? Many modern historians think this story, like many others, was an exaggeration or even a fabrication. It might have been a dark joke Caligula made at the expense of the senators, implying that his horse would do a better job than they did. It was a deliberate insult, a piece of political theater, but not a serious plan. This highlights the central problem with Caligula's story. How much is fact, and how much is hostile propaganda? Let's consider the source. The historians who wrote about Caligula were members of the senatorial class, the very group he seemed to despise and humiliate. They had every reason to portray him in the worst possible light. After Caligula was assassinated, the Senate wanted to erase his memory completely, a process called damnatio memoriae. It was in their interest to paint him as an insane monster to justify his murder and the subsequent restoration of their own power and dignity. For example, the tales of his wild spending might have been exaggerated to cover up the fact that he was actually trying to fund popular policies and building projects that the conservative Senate opposed. His claims of divinity, while shocking to traditional Roman sensibilities, weren't entirely unheard of in the eastern provinces of the empire, where rulers were often deified. Caligula may have been trying to create a new kind of absolutist monarchy, which would have terrified the old Roman aristocracy. So, was he insane? The illness he suffered early in his reign is a key point. Some speculate it could have been encephalitis, or a similar neurological condition that caused a personality change. Others suggest the immense pressure and trauma of his youth, combined with the absolute power he suddenly wielded, simply broke him psychologically. He may have suffered from paranoia, which, given his family history, would be completely understandable. He saw enemies everywhere because, in the Roman court, enemies often were asterisk everywhere. His cruelty could be seen as a preemptive strike against those he believed were plotting against him. His actions, while appearing mad, might have been a twisted, brutal form of political strategy designed to intimidate and control a senate he deeply distrusted. But whether he was clinically insane or just a ruthless autocrat, his reign couldn't last. His constant humiliation of the Senate, his unpredictable cruelty, and his alienation of the military elite created a powerful coalition of enemies. In January of 41 AD, after less than 4 years on the throne, Caligula was assassinated by officers of his own Praetorian Guard during a series of games. The conspirators didn't just kill him, they also murdered his wife and his infant daughter, brutally ending his bloodline to ensure no heir could seek revenge. It was a savage end to a savage reign. In the end, the true nature of Caligula remains one of history's great enigmas. The image of the mad emperor is so powerful, so compelling, that it's hard to see past it. He was almost certainly a cruel and narcissistic tyrant. His reign was a nightmare for the Roman elite. But he was also a product of a violent and paranoid system. The trauma of his youth, the absolute power he inherited, and the constant threat of conspiracy created a perfect storm. It's possible the stories were exaggerated by his enemies to justify their actions. The real Caligula might not have been a monster from a horror story, but a deeply damaged man who, when given limitless power, became a monster himself. His story serves as a chilling reminder that the line between a powerful leader and a dangerous tyrant can be terrifyingly thin. What do you think? Was Caligula truly mad, or was he a victim of history written by the victors? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most notorious figures, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. See you next time. But the happy days did not last. When Caligula was only 7 years old, a shadow fell over his life that would change its course forever. His father, the beloved hero Germanicus, died suddenly while on a mission in the east. He was just 30. The official cause was illness, but whispers of poison spread like wildfire. On his deathbed, Germanicus himself accused Gnaeus Calpurnius, Pisoth, the governor of Syria and a close ally of Emperor Tiberius, of orchestrating his murder. He made his friends swear an oath that they would avenge him. The news of Germanicus's death sent shock waves through the empire. His body was cremated in Antioch, and his ashes were placed in an urn to be carried back to Rome. The journey home became a massive, spontaneous funeral procession. People lined the roads, weeping and mourning the loss of their champion. When the ship carrying his remains finally arrived in Italy, it was met by a somber crowd of senators, soldiers, and citizens. The procession to Rome was one of the most emotional outpourings of grief the city had ever witnessed. Germanicus was more than just a general. He was the embodiment of Roman virtue, the hope for a better future, a link back to the golden age of Augustus. And now, he was gone. For young Caligula, this was not just a national tragedy. It was a shattering of his entire world. The father he idolized, the man who had paraded him before the legions, was now just a memory held in a cold stone urn. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was consumed by grief and a burning desire for justice. She was a woman of immense pride and courage, a granddaughter of Augustus himself. She didn't just believe her husband was murdered. She was convinced the order came from the very top, from Emperor Tiberius. She saw it as a political assassination, a move by the aging and increasingly paranoid emperor to eliminate a potential rival. And she was not one to suffer in silence. Upon her return to Rome, Agrippina made her accusations public. She marched into the palace, confronted Tiberius, and openly blamed him for her husband's death. This was an act of incredible bravery, but also of catastrophic political miscalculation. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the world. Tiberius, a master of cold, calculated cruelty, did not react with immediate fury. Instead, he allowed the trial of Piso to proceed. The evidence was damning, and public opinion was firmly against Piso. But before a verdict could be reached, Piso was found dead in his home, supposedly by his own hand. Conveniently, this prevented him from implicating anyone higher up. But the matter was far from over. Tiberius now saw Agrippina and her children not as family, but as a threat. The love the people had for Germanicus was now transferred to his surviving family, and that made them dangerous. The emperor began to slowly, methodically dismantle their lives. Agrippina was placed under constant surveillance. Her friends were arrested on trumped-up charges. The political atmosphere in Rome grew toxic with suspicion and fear. Caligula, once the darling of the empire, was now the son of a woman branded as an enemy of the state. He saw his world shrink, his friends disappear. The warmth of his early years was replaced by a chilling sense of dread. He was no longer a cute little mascot. He was a political pawn in a deadly game he couldn't possibly understand. Then, the hammer fell. On Tiberius's orders, Agrippina was arrested. This strong, proud woman was declared a public enemy and exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, the same island where Augustus had exiled his own daughter, Julia. It was a place of isolation and despair. But the emperor's revenge didn't stop there. Caligula's two older brothers, Nero and Drusus, were next. Nero, the eldest and the heir apparent after their father, was also arrested and banished to an island where he was forced to take his own life or was executed. Drusus, the second brother, was imprisoned in the dungeons of the palace on Palatine Hill. There, he was deliberately and slowly starved to death. The records say he was so desperate for food that he tried to eat the stuffing from his mattress. The cruelty was unimaginable. Imagine being Caligula. One day you are a prince of Rome, surrounded by love, adoration, and the glory of your heroic father. The next, your father is dead, your mother is exiled to a rock in the middle of the sea, and your brothers are systematically eliminated, one by one. He was left in the care of his great-grandmother, Livia, and then his grandmother, Antonia. He lived in the very palace where his brother was being starved in the basement. He had to walk its halls, knowing the emperor who ordered his family's destruction was just rooms away. He learned to survive. He buried his emotions, hid his thoughts, and perfected the art of wearing a mask. He became an expert flatterer, showing absolute obedience and deference to Tiberius. The historian Tacitus wrote that it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. He became a master of dissimulation. This was the brutal school that forged the future emperor, the boy who had everything lost it all. He learned firsthand that power was not about glory or justice. It was about survival. It was a vicious game where the penalty for losing was not just defeat, but the complete annihilation of your entire family. He saw love turned to hatred, loyalty to betrayal, and life to a slow, agonizing death. These weren't just political lessons. They were the deep psychological wounds that would fester for years. The trauma of his childhood, the constant fear, the profound loss all twisted something inside him. The cheerful little boy in the miniature soldier's boots was gone, replaced by a young man who understood the darkest aspects of human nature and imperial power. He was being groomed for survival in a snake pit, and he was learning his lessons well. The question that hangs over this period is, what does that do to a person? How can someone endure such horror without being irrevocably broken or warped by it? The seeds of the man Caligula would become were planted in these terrifying years. The paranoia, the cruelty, the erratic behavior that would later define his reign. Their roots can be traced back to this time when a little boy learned that the world was a terrifying place, and that the only thing that mattered was power. He would spend the next few years on the island of Capri, living side by side with the man who destroyed his family, Emperor Tiberius. It was the final, twisted chapter of his education, a masterclass in tyranny, paranoia, and debauchery, taught by the emperor himself. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, waiting for his turn, learning from the monster who held the keys. The happy days were a distant memory, a dream from another life. The reality was a nightmare from which he was yet to awaken, and when he did, he would unleash his own nightmare upon the Roman world. Thanks so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic lives of the Roman Empire, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you and miss our next deep dive into history. See you in the next video. You might think of the Roman Empire and picture grand arenas, disciplined legions, and emperors in shining armor. But today, we're not talking about glory. We're talking about a darkness that festered at the very heart of Rome, a darkness that would give birth to one of history's most infamous tyrants. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but on a beautiful island, a paradise that hid the empire's most terrifying secrets. And at the center of it all is a young boy, the last survivor of a doomed family, a boy named Caligula. To understand Caligula, we must first understand the man who held his life in his hands, Emperor Tiberius. By the time Caligula was a teenager, Tiberius was old, bitter, and drowning in paranoia. He had retreated from the bustling, treacherous city of Rome to the secluded island of Capri, and in a move that baffled the Roman elite, he summoned the young Caligula to join him. Why? Why bring the last son of his popular, deceased rival, Germanicus, into his inner circle? Was it a twisted act of kindness, or something far more sinister? Most people in Rome probably thought Caligula's days were numbered. After all, Tiberius, guided by his manipulative prefect Sejanus, had systematically destroyed Caligula's family. His father, the celebrated General Germanicus, died under mysterious circumstances, likely poisoned. His mother, Agrippina, the elder, was exiled and starved to death. His two older brothers were imprisoned and executed. Caligula was the last one left, a living reminder of a bloodline that many Romans still adored. Bringing him to Capri seemed like bringing a lamb to the slaughterhouse. But Tiberius didn't kill him. Not right away. Instead, he made Caligula a spectator, and the show he was forced to watch was a masterclass in terror. Capri wasn't a sun-drenched resort. It was Tiberius's personal fortress of fear, a political prison disguised as a palace. Here, away from the prying eyes of the Roman Senate and people, the emperor's darkest impulses ran free. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius paint a chilling picture. Executions were not public spectacles, but quiet, cold-blooded affairs. Men who displeased the emperor would simply disappear, their bodies tossed from the island's high cliffs into the sea below. Imagine being the young Caligula, walking through these luxurious villas, knowing that the very ground you stood on was soaked in the blood of men who, just days before, had been powerful figures in Rome. He saw senators, men of immense wealth and influence, groveling at Tiberius's feet, begging for their lives over some perceived slight. Caligula had to survive. He was a natural actor, a skill honed by a childhood of constant danger. On Capri, he perfected his performance. and in his place they saw a symbol of hope, the young, handsome son of the beloved Germanicus. The crowd saw the return of a golden age. They saw a fresh start. They had no idea that the boy they were cheering for was no longer the son of Germanicus. He was the student of Tiberius. He was a graduate of the Island of Fear. But it was all a performance, the same one he had perfected on the island. And soon, he would unleash that darkness upon the entire Roman Empire. Thank you for watching. The story of Caligula is a stark reminder of how environments of fear and trauma can shape a person, turning a victim into a villain. If you found this dive into the dark side of Roman history fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that you won't find in the usual history books. Let us know in the comments what you think was the defining moment that twisted Caligula's mind. See you in the next video. When the Emperor Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the city of Rome erupted in celebration. Imagine it. People flooding the streets, dancing and singing, their faces lit with a joy they hadn't felt in years. They offered up prayers to the gods, not just out of relief, but with genuine hope for a brighter future. And at the center of all this hope was one young man. Caligula, why him? Why all this celebration for a new, untested emperor? To understand that, you have to understand what Rome had just been through. Tiberius's reign had become a dark cloud over the city. He was old, suspicious, and had ruled from a distance, leaving Rome in the hands of men who governed through fear and paranoia. The atmosphere was suffocating. The people were tired of the endless treason trials, the political purges, and the cold, unfeeling grip of their absent emperor. So when news of his death arrived, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. And Caligula was that sun. He was everything Tiberius wasn't. He was young, just 24 years old, full of life and charisma. But more importantly, he was the son of Germanicus. His father was a military hero, a man beloved by the legions and the people alike. Germanicus represented a golden age that had been tragically cut short, and in Caligula, the people saw a second chance. They saw the return of that promise, that hope. The name Caligula itself was a fond nickname from the army, meaning little boots, given to him when he was just a boy in his father's military camps. He was the army's darling, the people's heir. So, when Caligula made his grand entry into Rome, the city greeted him as a savior. The historian Suetonius tells us that the crowds were so massive, so ecstatic, that over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in the following months as a sign of gratitude to the gods. The Senate, eager to put the past behind them, immediately granted him all the powers and titles his predecessors had accumulated over decades. They practically handed him the keys to the world, betting everything on this one young man. And for a little while, it seemed like their bet was going to pay off spectacularly. Caligula's first few months in power were a whirlwind of popular reforms. He was generous, and he was just. One of his very first acts was to issue a massive bonus to the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor, ensuring their loyalty from day one. But he didn't stop there. He extended that generosity to the people of Rome, fulfilling the bequests left in the wills of both Tiberius and even Livia Augustus's wife, which Tiberius had ignored. Money flowed back into the city, and the people loved him for it. He then turned his attention to justice. He put an immediate stop to the oppressive treason trials that had plagued Tiberius's later years. These trials had become a tool for political enemies to eliminate rivals, often on the flimsiest of evidence. Caligula declared them over. He burned the court records in the forum for all to see, a powerful symbolic act that declared a new era of transparency and fairness. He recalled exiles, people who had been banished under Tiberius, and freed those who had been unjustly imprisoned. Imagine the relief of families reunited, of reputations restored. It was a political amnesty that won him enormous goodwill. He showed respect to the institutions of Rome, something Tiberius had long neglected. He worked with the Senate, treating them as partners rather than subjects. He allowed magistrates to have full authority in their courts, restoring a sense of traditional republican order. He published a public budget, an account of the empire's finances, something no emperor had done before. This was an incredible gesture of openness, suggesting a ruler who had nothing to hide. For the common people, he brought back the fun. He staged lavish gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances. These weren't just distractions. They were a way for the emperor to connect with his subjects, to share in a collective Roman experience. The city felt alive again. For 7 glorious months, Rome was in a state of euphoria. They believed that they had found another Augustus, a ruler who would bring peace, prosperity, and justice. They thought their prayers had been answered. But happiness in Imperial Rome was a fragile thing, and beneath the surface of this perfect beginning, cracks were beginning to form. The first sign of trouble came in the autumn of 37 CE. Caligula fell gravely ill. We don't know exactly what it was, perhaps a fever, or maybe something more like a nervous breakdown from the immense pressure. The entire empire held its breath. The joy that had filled the streets just months before turned to anxious prayer. People offered their own lives to the gods if only the young emperor would be spared. And he was. He recovered, but when he emerged from his illness, he was a different man. The cheerful, generous, and just ruler was gone. In his place was someone unpredictable, paranoid, and cruel. The man who had burned the treason trial records now brought them back with a vengeance. The man who had respected the Senate now openly mocked and humiliated them. The man who had been a symbol of hope became a symbol of terror. Historians have debated for centuries what happened. Did the illness cause some kind of brain damage, transforming his personality? Or did they brush with death, and the absolute adoration he received during it convince him that he was more than a man? Did it inflate his ego to divine proportions? Perhaps the power was too much for him from the start, and the illness simply stripped away the mask he had been wearing. Whatever the cause, the dream was over. The stories of his reign from this point on become a catalogue of absurdity and horror. He supposedly planned to make his favorite horse, Incitus, a consul. While this is likely an exaggeration, it reflects the Senate's feeling of utter powerlessness and his contempt for their traditions. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, blurring the line between emperor and deity in a way that deeply offended Roman sensibilities. He built a 2-mile floating bridge across the Bay of Baia, just to ride his horse across it. A pointless and incredibly expensive stunt meant only to prove that he could tame the sea itself. His personal life was just as scandalous. He was accused of having incestuous relationships with his sisters, particularly his favorite, Drusilla. After she died, he had her deified, forcing the entire empire to worship her as a goddess, and he reportedly punished people who were not grieving enough. His cruelty became legendary. He would have people executed on a whim, sometimes for the slightest offense, or for no reason at all. There are tales of him at the games, being bored by the scheduled events, and ordering a section of the crowd to be thrown into the arena with the wild animals. The treasury, which he had so generously opened at the start of his reign, was quickly emptied by his extravagant spending. To refill it, he turned to extortion. He revived the treason trials as a way to confiscate the wealth of rich senators. He imposed bizarre new taxes on everything imaginable. He turned the palace into a brothel to raise funds. The man who had been hailed as a savior was now bankrupting and terrorizing his own people. The Senate, the army, and even his own guards. The Praetorians began to see that Caligula was not just a bad emperor. He was a threat to the stability of the entire Roman world. His behavior was erratic, his decisions were irrational, and his cruelty was boundless. The hope of 37 CE had curdled into the nightmare of 40 CE. The man they had prayed for was now the man they prayed would be gone. And so, the conspiracies began. The very people who had protected him, who had been the first to benefit from his rule, now plotted his downfall. In January of 41 CE, less than 4 years after he came to power, a group of Praetorian Guard officers, led by a man named Cassius Rhea, cornered Caligula in a secluded palace corridor. Sharia, whom Caligula had often mocked for his high-pitched voice, struck the first blow. The other conspirators then swarmed in, stabbing the emperor over and over again. They didn't stop. In their fury, they also murdered his wife and their infant daughter. The news of his death did not bring the same celebrations that Tiberius's had. Instead, it brought confusion and fear. The dream of a new golden age had ended in a bloody assassination. Rome was left with a dead tyrant, a murdered royal family, and no clear successor. The story of Caligula is a tragic cautionary tale. It shows how quickly absolute power can corrupt, and how the brightest hopes can sour into the darkest realities. For a few short months, Rome thought it had found its perfect prince, but what it got was one of history's most infamous monsters. The little boots had walked a very dark path. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into Roman history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the ancient world. Let me know in the comments what you think was Caligula, mad, or just bad. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what turns a beloved leader into a feared tyrant? Today, we're diving deep into the story of one of history's most notorious emperors, Caligula. But we're not just talking about the crazy stories you might have heard. We're going back to the beginning, to a single event that changed everything. The moment a promising young ruler stepped onto a path of madness and paranoia. When Gaius Caesar, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, first became emperor in 37 AD. Rome rejoiced. The city was ecstatic. Think of it like the biggest citywide party you can imagine, lasting for weeks. Caligula was the son of the beloved general Germanicus. He was young, handsome, and charismatic. He seemed to be everything the people wanted after the gloomy and suspicious final years of his predecessor, Tiberius. His first few months were a dream. He freed citizens who had been unjustly imprisoned by Tiberius. He burned the records of their treason trials in a huge public bonfire, signaling a new era of trust and openness. He hosted lavish games and chariot races for the public, showering them with his generosity. He even recalled exiles. For a moment, it seemed like a golden age was dawning. The people adored him, the Senate respected him, and the future of Rome looked bright and secure. But this golden age was destined to be tragically short. Just 6 months into his reign, disaster struck. Caligula fell gravely, mysteriously ill. The entire empire held its breath. People gathered in the streets, praying for his recovery. Some even vowed to give their own lives if the gods would only spare their beloved emperor. The cause of this illness is still debated by historians. Was it poison? A political enemy trying to remove him? Some ancient sources suggest this, pointing to the constant intrigue within the imperial court. Or was it a physical ailment? Modern scholars have proposed everything from epilepsy to encephalitis, a severe inflammation of the brain. Whatever the true cause, the effect was catastrophic. When Caligula finally emerged from his sickbed, he was a changed man. The cheerful, open, and generous youth was gone forever. In his place stood someone entirely different, someone dark, suspicious, and consumed by paranoia. The man who had burned the treason records now saw traitors lurking in every shadow. The man who had been a friend to the Senate now saw them as a den of conspirators plotting against him. This was the turning point. This is where the story of Caligula, the monster, truly begins. His first major act after his recovery was to order the death of the man who had been named his heir during his illness, his cousin Tiberius. The charge was plotting against him. This sent a shockwave through Rome. It was the first sign that the rules had changed. Soon, no one was safe. He started to see conspiracies everywhere. He accused high-ranking senators and wealthy citizens of treason, often on the flimsiest of evidence. Their real crime, their Wealth. Caligula had spent lavishly in his first few months, and the imperial treasury was running low. By condemning wealthy Romans, he could confiscate their property and refill his coffers. It was a brutal and effective, but terrifying, way to fund his extravagant lifestyle. His paranoia also extended to his own family. He forced his father-in-law to take his own life. He exiled his own sisters, whom he had once publicly honored, accusing them of adultery and conspiracy. He trusted no one. His world had shrunk to a tiny circle of fear, and he ruled from its center. He began to demand that he be worshipped as a living god, a move that deeply offended Roman tradition. He built temples to himself and even tried to have a giant statue of himself placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, an act that nearly caused a massive rebellion. And what about those famous stories? The ones about making his horse incitatus a consul, while he probably didn't literally give the horse a government position. Ancient writers tell us he treated the horse better than most senators. Incitatus had a marble stable, an ivory manger, and even a house with servants. Caligula would invite the horse to dinner parties. Was this madness, or was it a calculated insult to the Senate? A way of saying, my horse is more worthy of honor than any of you. It was a demonstration of his absolute power, showing that his whims, no matter how absurd, were law. He also became known for his cruel and unpredictable behavior. He was said to enjoy watching tortures and executions during his meals. He would joke about killing his guests. At the games, if he was bored, he would order the guards to throw a section of the crowd into the arena to be eaten by wild animals. He declared, "I wish the Roman people had but one neck, so I could cut it off with a single blow." This quote, whether he truly said it or not, perfectly captures the tyrant he had become. A man who held the lives of millions in his hands and saw them as nothing more than playthings for his amusement and rage. His reign of terror lasted less than 4 years. The fear and hatred he inspired couldn't be contained forever. The very people who were meant to protect him, the Praetorian Guard, grew tired of his insults and his dangerous unpredictability. In January of 41 AD, a group of guards, led by an officer Caligula had repeatedly mocked, cornered him in a palace corridor. They stabbed him to death. His wife and young daughter were also murdered shortly after. The Senate briefly considered restoring the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had already declared Caligula's uncle, Claudius, the new emperor. So what do we make of Caligula? Was he born a monster, or was he made one? The evidence strongly suggests that his illness was the catalyst. It seems to have triggered a profound psychological break, transforming him from a popular leader into a paranoid despot. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile the human mind can be, and how the health of one person in power can change the course of history for millions. The story of Caligula isn't just about a crazy emperor. It's a cautionary tale about absolute power, the corrosive effects of fear, and the terrifying moment when a hero becomes the villain. What do you think? Was it the illness that drove him mad, or was the tyrant always lurking just beneath the surface? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into the most fascinating moments in history. See you next time. Picture this: Rome, the heart of an empire, and a new emperor on the throne. His name is Gaius, but history will remember him as Caligula. Freshly crowned, he has a vision of grandeur, of spectacle, of a Rome more glorious than ever before. And he decides the best way to achieve this is to spend. And spend he did, like no emperor had ever dared to before. Imagine the skyline of ancient Rome, suddenly dotted with new, breathtaking structures, massive aqueducts snaking across the landscape, opulent palaces rising towards the heavens, and even a floating bridge of boats stretching 4 miles across the Bay of Naples, just so Caligula could ride his favorite horse across it. He wasn't just building, he was making statements in stone and marble. He wanted the people to see his power, to feel his generosity. So, the public celebrations began. The Circus Maximus roared with crowds day after day for chariot races. The Colosseum, not yet built, had its predecessors where gladiators fought in epic, bloody contests. Festivals seemed to never end. There were free food distributions, lavish banquets open to the public, and theatrical performances that went on for days. For the average Roman citizen, it was a golden age of entertainment. Caligula was buying their love, and it was working. The cheers in the streets were deafening. He was the people's emperor, the one who brought them bread and circuses on an unprecedented scale. He showered them with gifts, throwing gold and silver coins into crowds, watching as people scrambled for a piece of his imperial generosity. He wanted to be loved, adored, and he was willing to pay any price for it. But every coin has two sides, and the gleaming gold being tossed to the masses was coming from somewhere, and that somewhere was the Roman treasury. The treasury, once overflowing with the spoils of conquest and generations of careful management, started to feel the strain. The vaults that had seemed bottomless were now echoing with emptiness. An advisor might have suggested cutting back, maybe fewer games, maybe delaying a palace or two. But Caligula wasn't an emperor of moderation. Slowing down was admitting a limit, and to him, an emperor had no limits. If the state's money was running out, he would simply have to find a new source of income. And he knew exactly where to look. His gaze turned towards the gilded villas of Rome's elite, the senators and aristocrats whose families had accumulated vast fortunes over centuries. This was where the real money was, locked away in private coffers. And Caligula devised a chillingly effective plan to get it. The charge was almost always the same: treason. Majestus, a crime against the emperor and the state. Suddenly, the wealthiest and most powerful men in Rome found themselves facing accusations. Sometimes, these charges were based on whispers, a rumor overheard at a dinner party, a misinterpreted comment. A noble might be accused of plotting against the emperor because he didn't look happy enough at the latest games. Other times, the accusations were based on absolutely nothing at all. Caligula didn't need evidence. His word was law. The trials, if you could even call them that, were a farce. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Once a nobleman was declared guilty of treason, the punishment was swift. Not only would he face execution or exile, but his entire estate, his lands, his homes, his gold, all of it was confiscated by the state. And by the state, everyone knew that meant it went directly to Caligula. This created a river of private wealth flowing directly into the emperor's personal spending fund. The parties continued. The games got even more spectacular, and the construction projects became even more ambitious. To the public, it looked like the emperor's generosity was truly endless. They didn't see the dark mechanism working behind the scenes. They just saw the spectacle. But within the marble halls of the Senate, a different emotion was brewing. It wasn't love or adoration. It was cold, hard fear. The very men who were supposed to advise the emperor, the pillars of Roman society, were now his targets. They lived in a constant state of anxiety. Who would be next? A careless word, a perceived slight, or simply owning too much could be a death sentence. Caligula was systematically dismantling the power and wealth of the aristocracy. He wasn't just taking their money. He was taking their dignity, their security, their lives. He was turning his natural allies into his most bitter and dangerous enemies. Did Caligula care? Not in the slightest. In fact, he seemed to relish it. He had once famously said, "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me." This wasn't just a saying for him. It became his governing philosophy. He no longer sought the respect of the Senate. He demanded their terror. He would humiliate senators publicly, making them run for miles beside his chariot, or inviting them to dinner only to mock them. He believed that fear was a more reliable tool of control than loyalty or respect. A loyal man might waver, but a terrified man will always obey. He was isolating himself, creating an echo chamber where the only sounds were the cheers of the manipulated crowd and the silent, seething hatred of the powerful. The Roman elite, who had once celebrated his rise to power, now whispered in shadowed corners. They saw an emperor who was not just extravagant, but unstable. An emperor who ruled not through law and tradition, but through terror and whim. The treasury was being refilled, but the foundation of the empire was cracking. Caligula's reign of spectacle, founded by fear, was setting the stage for a dramatic and violent conclusion. The more he spent, and the more he terrorized, the closer he pushed his enemies to a point where they felt they had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy of all. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic stories of ancient Rome, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. See you in the next video. History often remembers him as the Mad Emperor, a monster who terrorized Rome. But was Caligula truly insane? Or was he the victim of one of history's most successful smear campaigns? To understand the man, we have to look past the legends and into the snake pit of Roman politics. When Gaius Caesar, nicknamed Caligula or Le But by his father's soldiers, first took the throne, Rome celebrated. The people loved him. He was the son of the beloved general Germanicus, and his reign promised a fresh start after the gloomy final years of his predecessor, Tiberius. He began by freeing political prisoners, cutting taxes, and hosting lavish games for the public. For a brief moment, it seemed like a golden age was dawning, but behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The Roman Senate, a body of powerful and wealthy aristocrats, had grown accustomed to wielding significant influence. They saw themselves as the true guardians of Rome, and they expected the emperor to respect their authority. Caligula, however, was young, headstrong, and had a very different idea of what it meant to be emperor. He saw himself as an absolute ruler, a god on earth, not just the first citizen among equals. This fundamental clash of wills would set the stage for a conflict that would end in blood. As the tension between Caligula and the Senate escalated, a flood of scandalous stories began to circulate through the city. These weren't just idle gossip. They were targeted political attacks, designed to erode his authority and turn the people against him. Ancient writers, many of whom were senators or aligned with the senatorial class, recorded these tales, painting a portrait of a depraved tyrant. They claimed he forced senators to run 4 miles alongside his chariot, treating them like servants. They wrote that he appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul, a story that has become his most famous act of madness. Though modern historians doubt this actually happened, it was a brilliant piece of propaganda. It suggested Caligula held the esteemed Senate in such contempt that he believed even a horse could do their job. It was the ultimate insult. The attacks grew more personal and more vicious. Stories spread that he mocked Rome's most sacred religious traditions, even demanding to be worshipped as a living god. This was a direct challenge to Roman values and deeply offended the conservative elite. His public behavior was described as increasingly erratic. They said he would burst into laughter for no reason in the middle of important meetings or wander the palace at night, screaming for the sun to rise. Cruelty to his own family became a central theme of the anti-Caligula narrative. They accused him of incestuous relationships with his sisters, especially his favorite, Drusilla. After her early death, his profound and public grief was twisted into something unnatural and sinister. The rumors alleged he had executed his cousin and father-in-law on trumped-up charges, clearing the path of any potential rivals. Every action was interpreted in the worst possible light. These stories, whether true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated, served a clear purpose. In a society without mass media, rumor was a potent political weapon. A whisper in the right ear could destroy a reputation. A scandalous story repeated in the bathhouses and marketplaces could turn public opinion against even the most powerful leader. Caligula's enemies in the Senate were masters of this game. They understood that if they couldn't defeat him in the political arena, they could destroy him in the court of public opinion. Caligula's sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livia, and the late Drusilla, were not just family. They were powerful figures in their own right. As members of the Imperial family, their lives were under constant scrutiny, and they became pawns in this dangerous political war. The rumors of incest were designed not only to taint Caligula's character, but also to undermine the legitimacy and moral standing of his entire family. Every private conversation, every family dinner, every display of affection within the palace walls was a potential scandal waiting to be weaponized. The whispers became a torrent of accusations, trapping the imperial family in a web of suspicion. How did Caligula react to this relentless assault on his character? Not with political savvy or careful patience, but with fury. He saw the rumors for what they were, a direct challenge to his authority. He responded by lashing out. He arrested and executed senators he suspected of treason, often with little evidence. He seized their property, further enriching the imperial treasury, but also creating more enemies. His anger and paranoia seemed to confirm the very stories being spread about him. His harsh reactions didn't silence the whispers. They amplified them. Each punishment was seen as another act of tyranny, proving to his opponents that he was unfit to rule. The Senate, feeling cornered and threatened, became more determined than ever to remove him from power. The cycle of rumor, reaction, and retribution spiraled out of control. Caligula grew more isolated, trusting no one. The Senate grew more unified in their opposition. The people of Rome, bombarded with tales of his supposed madness and cruelty, began to fear the man they once adored. The stage was set for a final, violent conclusion. The propaganda had worked. In January of the year 41, after less than 4 years on the throne, Caligula was assassinated by officers of his own Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers meant to protect him. The conspiracy was wide-ranging, involving senators and courtiers who had finally decided they could no longer tolerate his rule. His death was brutal, a bloody end to a reign consumed by conflict. So, was Caligula the monster history remembers, or was he a young, inexperienced ruler who was systematically destroyed by a political machine he couldn't control? The truth is likely somewhere in between. He was undoubtedly an autocrat who made powerful enemies, but many of the most lurid tales about him were almost certainly propaganda, crafted by those enemies to justify his murder. The story of Caligula is a powerful reminder that history is often written by the victors. The rumors that destroyed an emperor in his own time became the facts that defined his legacy for millennia. The whispers from the Roman Senate echoed through the centuries, creating the legend of the Mad Emperor. What do you think? Was Caligula a victim of a brilliant smear campaign? Or did his own actions prove his enemies right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this journey into the complexities of Roman history, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. See you next time. Have you ever heard of a war against the ocean? It sounds ridiculous, right? But for the Roman Emperor Caligula, it was just another day at the office. To understand how things got so bizarre, we need to remember the political climate in Rome. Tensions were high. Caligula had survived several conspiracies, and the Senate was filled with whispers and plots. He needed a distraction, something to unite the people and remind everyone who was in charge. What better way to do that than a glorious military victory? So, Caligula decided to launch a series of campaigns. But these weren't your typical Roman conquests. They were strange, confusing, and ultimately pretty pointless. His first target was Germania. He marched his legions north, full of grand pronouncements about conquering the fierce Germanic tribes. But once he got there, the actual war was a bit of a letdown. Instead of epic battles, there were mostly theatrical displays. In one instance, he had some of his own foreign bodyguards cross a river and hide in a forest. Then, his scouts would discover them, and Caligula would lead a heroic charge to capture these fake enemies. He would then return to camp, praising his men for their bravery in a battle that never actually happened. It was all for show, a carefully staged performance to create the illusion of a great military commander. But the real spectacle was yet to come. After his victories in Germania, Caligula marched his army towards the English Channel, with the stated goal of invading Britain. This was a massive undertaking, something even the great Julius Caesar had struggled with. The soldiers were assembled on the coast of Gaul, staring across the water at the misty shores of Britain. The tension was palpable. They were ready for the fight of their lives. Caligula rode before them, gave a rousing speech, and ordered the trumpets to sound the signal for battle. The soldiers gripped their swords, ready to board the ships. And then, Caligula gave one of the strangest commands in military history. He ordered his men to collect seashells. That's right. Thousands of heavily armed Roman soldiers were instructed to wade into the water and fill their helmets and tunic folds with shells. According to the ancient historians, Caligula declared these shells to be the spoils of the ocean, a tribute plundered from the sea god Neptune himself. The soldiers, utterly bewildered, had no choice but to obey their emperor. They scoured the beach, gathering up these treasures as if they had just won a great victory. Caligula then had the shells packed up and sent back to Rome to be displayed as proof of his conquest over the sea. Now, historians have debated this story for centuries. Was Caligula genuinely insane? Was he mocking his own army for their reluctance to invade Britain? Or was it a symbolic act that we just don't understand today? Some scholars suggest the Latin word for shells. Musculi could also mean engineers' huts, implying he was just ordering them to dismantle their camp. But the image of soldiers collecting seashells is what stuck. It's the story that ancient writers chose to tell, and it became a defining moment of his reign. Whether it was a literal order or a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion, the damage was done. The story spread like wildfire. Back in Rome, generals who had fought real battles mocked him behind closed doors. They couldn't believe the emperor was treating a beach trip like a military campaign. In te Senate, the whispers grew louder. Senators who already despised him now had concrete proof, in their eyes, that he had lost his mind. His sanity was openly questioned. How could a man who declared war on the sea be fit to rule the world's greatest empire? Even the loyalty of the common soldiers began to fracture. These were hardened veterans, men who had faced death on countless battlefields. Being ordered to collect seashells was not just confusing, it was deeply insulting. It made a mockery of their profession and their honor. Doubt began to creep into the ranks. Their commander, the man they were sworn to follow into any battle, seemed to be living in his own fantasy world. The respect and fear that an emperor commanded were slowly eroding, replaced by ridicule and disbelief. As his reputation as a military leader crumbled, Caligula's ego only grew larger. Perhaps to compensate for the mockery, he began to demand something that no Roman emperor before him had dared to ask for while still alive: to be worshipped as a living god. In Roman tradition, exceptional emperors could be deified, but only after their death. Caligula wanted that divine status immediately. He started referring to himself by the names of gods like Jupiter and Apollo. He even had the heads of famous statues of gods in Rome removed and replaced with sculptures of his own head. He was blurring the line between emperor and deity, a move that was profoundly shocking to Roman sensibilities. This demand for divine worship wasn't just a personal whim. It had serious political and religious consequences. He ordered the construction of temples dedicated to his own divinity. He even established a priesthood in his own honor, with the most expensive animals being sacrificed to him daily. His own horse, Incitatus, was famously made a member of this new priestly college. For traditional Romans, who held their religious customs dear, this was sacrilege. It was an act of supreme arrogance that flew in the face of centuries of tradition. The issue became particularly explosive when he turned his attention to the province of Judea. Caligula ordered that a colossal golden statue of himself be erected in the most sacred place in Judaism, the temple in Jerusalem. This was an unthinkable act of desecration for the Jews, for whom the worship of idols was a grave sin. The governor of Syria, Petronius, was tasked with carrying out this order. When he arrived with his legions, he was met by tens of thousands of unarmed Jewish farmers, who peacefully protested. They told Petronius that they would rather die than see their temple defiled. Petronius was in an impossible position. If he carried out the order, he would trigger a massive rebellion that could engulf the entire region in war. If he disobeyed, he would face the wrath of Caligula, which almost certainly meant execution. He wrote desperate letters back to Rome, trying to stall, explaining the catastrophic consequences of the emperor's command. He was walking a tightrope, trying to prevent a bloodbath, while saving his own skin. This single order showed just how disconnected from reality Caligula had become. He was willing to provoke a massive war and alienate an entire population just to satisfy his own ego. The young, hopeful emperor who had been welcomed with such joy just a few years earlier was now unrecognizable. The man who had promised a new golden age was now seen as a dangerous, unpredictable tyrant. His strange military campaigns, his demands for godhood, and his total disregard for the traditions and beliefs of his people had alienated everyone. From the highest senator to the common soldier, the empire was turning against him. The hero had become the villain, and the stage was set for a dramatic and violent end to his reign. The whispers in the Senate were no longer just whispers. They were becoming a conspiracy. The Roman world was holding its breath, wondering what the mad emperor would do next, and how much longer they could possibly endure it. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into Caligula's bizarre world interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the wild side of history. See you next time. Imagine living in a city where the most powerful man in the world is also the most unstable. A man whose whims could mean life or death, whose paranoia could shatter families in an instant. This wasn't a dystopian novel. This was reality for the people of Rome under the Emperor Caligula. The story of his descent from a beloved young ruler into a feared tyrant is a chilling reminder of how absolute power can corrupt. Absolutely. When Caligula first came to power, Rome celebrated. He was the son of the revered General Germanicus, a breath of fresh air after the gloomy reign of Tiberius. He freed unjustly imprisoned citizens, abolished unfair taxes, and entertained the public with lavish games. For 7 glorious months, it seemed like a golden age had dawned. The people loved him. The Senate adored him. He could do no wrong. But then, a mysterious illness struck him down. He lay on the brink of death for weeks, and the entire empire held its breath. When he finally recovered, something within him had changed. The charming, benevolent young emperor was gone. In his place stood a monster. The first signs were subtle, then increasingly bizarre. He began to demand that he be worshipped as a living god. He built temples to himself, complete with his own priests. He'd have conversations with the moon and order the sea to be whipped for its insolence. His eccentricities were initially dismissed, perhaps as lingering effects of his illness, but then the paranoia took root. It started as a small seed of distrust and grew into a suffocating vine that choked the life out of his court and the city of Rome itself. He saw enemies everywhere. Every whisper in the hallway was a plot. Every sidelong glance was a sign of betrayal. The Senate, which had once praised him, became a nest of conspirators in his mind. He believed they were constantly scheming to overthrow him, to undo his divine authority. He would humiliate them publicly, forcing distinguished senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, or making them serve him dinner dressed as slaves. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a calculated effort to break their spirit, to show them that their status meant nothing before his absolute power. His paranoia wasn't limited to the political elite. His own generals, the very men sworn to defend the empire, were viewed with suspicion. A successful military campaign wasn't a victory for Rome. It was a threat to Caligula's own glory. A popular general was a rival for the people's affection. So, he began to strike first, not waiting for proof of disloyalty, but acting on the flimsiest of suspicions. He ordered arrests, based on rumors. He conducted sham trials, where the verdict was decided before the accused even spoke. Executions became commonplace. Men who had been his friends, who had advised him, suddenly found themselves declared enemies of the state. Their only crime was existing in a world ruled by a man who trusted no one. It was a reign of terror, fueled by delusion. The city of Rome, once a beacon of law and order, became a landscape of fear. No one felt safe. Your wealth, your family name, your loyalty, none of it mattered. If the emperor's paranoid gaze fell upon you, your fate was sealed. This wasn't just about eliminating perceived threats. It was also about money. Caligula's lavish spending on games, palaces, and personal extravagances had drained the Roman treasury. To refill his coffers, he turned to a brutal and efficient method. Seizing the property of the wealthy, he would accuse rich citizens of treason, execute them, and then confiscate their entire estate. It was a twisted form of state-sanctioned robbery. He even opened a brothel in his own palace, forcing the wives and daughters of senators to work there, all to generate more income for his insatiable appetites. The terror wasn't confined to the palace walls. It seeped into the very fabric of daily life in Rome. People became afraid to speak their minds, even in the privacy of their own homes. Friends would eye each other with suspicion. Who could be an informer? Who might report a careless word to the palace guard? The vibrant social life of the capital withered. People stayed home, hoping not to draw attention to themselves. The markets were quieter, the public squares less crowded. A collective anxiety settled over the city like a thick fog. Rome had known cruel emperors before. Tiberius had been gloomy and suspicious. But Caligula's cruelty was different. It was unpredictable. It was irrational. There was no logic to it, no way to anticipate who would be next. One day, you could be in the emperor's favor, dining at his table. The next, you could be on a list for execution. This randomness is what made him so uniquely terrifying. It was a psychological war waged on an entire population. The uncertainty was a form of torture in itself. His own family was not exempt. He grew suspicious of those closest to him, the very people who had stood by him. He had his cousin and father-in-law executed. He exiled his own sisters, accusing them of plotting against him. In his mind, the betrayal was most dangerous when it came from within his own household. The man who was supposed to be the father of the nation had turned on his own family, consuming them in his ever-growing madness. No one was safe from the storm of his paranoia. Think of the sheer mental toll this must have taken on the Roman people. Every day began with the question, will I survive until nightfall? Will my family be safe? Will a soldier appear at my door with a death warrant signed by an emperor who believes the whispers of ghosts? This constant grinding fear changes a society. It erodes trust, destroys communities, and leaves behind a deep, collective trauma. The story of Caligula is more than just a tale of a mad emperor. It's the story of a city held hostage by the delusions of one man. But even the most absolute tyranny has its limits. The fear Caligula inspired eventually turned to desperation. The very people he sought to control the senators he humiliated. The guards who protected him began to realize that their own survival depended on his removal. The paranoia that Caligula used as a weapon would ultimately be the cause of his own downfall. The net was closing in, and the final act of this tragic and terrifying reign was about to unfold. The fear he had so carefully cultivated had finally backfired. It forced those with the power to act into a corner. They could either wait to be the next victims of his paranoia, or they could strike first. A conspiracy began to form, not just with one group, but with several. Senators, equestrians, and most importantly, officers of his own Praetorian Guard. The elite soldiers who were his personal bodyguards. They knew his routines. They knew his weaknesses. They were the ones who could get close enough to end the nightmare. On January 24th, 41 AD, during a series of games held at the palace, the conspirators made their move. As Caligula was walking through a private corridor, he was cornered by the guards, led by an officer named Cassius Syria, whom Caligula had often mocked. They unleashed their pent-up rage and fear. The reign of terror was over. The city of Rome could finally breathe again. Caligula's story serves as a dark chapter in Roman history, a cautionary tale about what happens when one man has too much power and too little sanity. It shows how a single, paranoid mind can hold an entire empire in its grip, and how fear can be both a tool of control and the seed of destruction. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of Roman history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. Let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next video. By the 4th year of Caligula's reign, a shadow had fallen over Rome. The laughter that once echoed through the Imperial palace now sounded hollow, tinged with a dangerous edge. For the powerful men of the city, the senators, the generals, and even the emperor's own protectors, that laughter was the sound of their world crumbling. The Roman Senate, once the proud heart of the Republic, was now a stage for Caligula's cruel theater. These were men from ancient families, whose ancestors had built the very foundations of Rome. Now, they were forced to watch as the emperor mocked their traditions, seized their fortunes, and treated their esteemed institution like his personal plaything. Imagine the humiliation. One day you are a respected statesman, shaping the future of the world's greatest empire. And the next you are running alongside the emperor's chariot for miles, dressed in your finest toga. Simply for his amusement, Caligula demanded they treat him as a living god, a declaration that was not just arrogant, but deeply offensive to Roman religious and cultural sensibilities. He would strip them of their wealth on a whim, inventing new, absurd taxes just to fund his lavish lifestyle. These weren't just financial losses. They were attacks on their family legacies, on generations of power and influence. The desperation in the Senate halls was thick enough to taste. They whispered in shadowed corners, their faces etched with fear and a growing, simmering rage. The man they were supposed to advise was not just ignoring them. He was actively destroying them. And it wasn't just the politicians. Rome's military elite, the decorated generals who had conquered lands and secured the empire's borders, felt a different kind of shame. These were men of action, men of discipline and honor. Caligula, however, had a flair for the dramatic and a disdain for genuine military achievement. He once marched a massive army to the northern coast, as if preparing for a grand invasion of Britain. The soldiers were ready. The stage was set for a glorious campaign, and then Caligula gave his order. Collect seashells. The legionaries, the most feared fighting force in the world, were ordered to fill their helmets with shells as spoils of the ocean. It was a farce, a bizarre, costly, and deeply insulting spectacle that made a mockery of the Roman army's prestige. Generals who had faced down fearsome tribes were now props in Caligula's absurd performance art. They returned to Rome, not with conquered foes, but with baskets of shells, their honor tarnished. How could they command the respect of their soldiers, or the fear of their enemies, when their own emperor treated them like fools? The stability of the empire depended on the strength and morale of its army, and Caligula was eroding it from the inside out with his unpredictable whims. Perhaps the most dangerous group Caligula alienated was his own personal security force, the Praetorian Guard. These were the elite, soldiers stationed in Rome, tasked with protecting the emperor's life. Their loyalty was meant to be absolute, but even they were not safe from Caligula's taunts and provocations. He particularly enjoyed mocking one of their officers, a man named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea had a high-pitched voice, and Caligula never missed an opportunity to ridicule him for it. In public, in front of other soldiers, Caligula would use offensive, effeminate passwords when Chaerea was on duty, or make lewd gestures. This wasn't just a personal insult. It was a public humiliation of a senior officer, undermining his authority and the dignity of the guard itself. For the Praetorians, this was a disturbing sign. Their job was to protect the emperor, but this emperor seemed intent on threatening their own honor and stability. If he could turn on his own bodyguards, who was safe, a dangerous thought began to percolate through their barracks. Their duty was to protect the emperor, but what if their ultimate duty was to protect Rome from the emperor? Their proximity gave them unparalleled access, and their frustration was turning into a deadly weapon. Slowly, carefully, the whispers in the Senate halls, the barracks, and the villas of the powerful began to connect. A conspiracy started to take shape, not as a single, unified plot at first, but as a convergence of shared desperation. Senators who had lost their fortunes and their dignity found common cause with generals who felt their honor had been stained. And most importantly, they found willing partners in the very men who guarded the emperor's life. The Praetorian Guard, led by the endlessly mocked Cassius Chaerea, became the sharp end of the spear. This wasn't just a coup driven by a few ambitious men. It was a broad coalition of Rome's ruling class. They saw an empire teetering on the brink of collapse. The economy was in shambles due to Caligula's extravagant spending. The military was demoralized, and the political system was paralyzed by fear. They believed that if Caligula remained in power, the entire Roman world, built over centuries of conquest and law, could unravel in a matter of years. The conspirators weren't just fighting for their own survival or power. They saw themselves as saviors of Rome. They needed to replace Caligula with someone stable, someone predictable, someone who respected Roman traditions. The chaos had to end. The plan they devised was brutal in its simplicity. They wouldn't challenge Caligula on the Senate floor or on the battlefield. That would be playing his game. They needed to strike where he felt most invincible, within the supposed safety of his own palace. The conspirators decided to act during the Palatine Games, an annual festival held in honor of the first emperor, Augustus. It was a public event, filled with crowds and distractions. Caligula, a lover of spectacle, would be in his element, relaxed, arrogant, and surrounded by people. The conspirators, including Chaerea and other Praetorians, would be on duty, their presence part of the routine security detail. No one would suspect a thing. Their strategy was to isolate him. They would wait for a moment when he was moving through one of the palace's private corridors, away from the main crowd but still surrounded by his supposed protectors. The attack had to be swift and decisive. There could be no hesitation, no chance for him to escape or call for loyal guards. It was a high-stakes gambling. If they led, the revenge Caligula would exact upon them and their families was too horrific to imagine. But if they succeeded, they could pull Rome back from the abyss. The fate of the empire rested on a few minutes of coordinated, bloody violence. The chosen day was January 24th, 41 AD. The games were underway, and Caligula was enjoying the performances. As he left the theater to head to lunch, he decided to take a shortcut through a secluded palace passageway, intending to inspect a group of young actors. This was the moment. The conspirators had been waiting, tensing for the signal. As Caligula paused to speak with the actors, Cassius Scheria approached him. According to some accounts, Caligula taunted him one last time, using a demeaning password. Scheria's response was not verbal. He drew his sword and struck the first blow, slashing Caligula's neck or shoulder. The emperor stumbled, stunned. Then, the other conspirators swarmed. It was not a clean, single strike. It was a frenzied, furious assault. Dozens of wounds were inflicted as each man, driven by years of fear and humiliation, plunged his blade into the emperor. The living god was cut down in a dark corridor, his own guards becoming his assassins. The chaos they had sought to end was unleashed in a torrent of violence. In their fury, they didn't stop with the emperor. His wife and his young daughter were also murdered, a brutal act to ensure no heir could claim the throne or seek revenge. The line of Germanicus, once beloved by the Roman people, was extinguished in blood. The deed was done. Caligula was dead. But as the assassins stood over his body, a new, terrifying question filled the silence. What now? They had ended the madness, but in its place, they had created a power vacuum. The chaos was far from over. It had just entered a new, uncertain chapter. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic tales of Roman history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of power, betrayal, and the figures who shaped the ancient world. See you next time. Have you ever heard of the emperor who made his horse a consul? The one who declared himself a living god and demanded to be worshipped? Yes, we're talking about Caligula, one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. His name alone brings to mind images of madness, cruelty, and absolute power gone wild. But was he truly the monster history paints him to be? Or is there more to the story of the man-born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus? Today, we are going to peel back the layers of legend and propaganda to uncover the truth about Caligula, his shocking reign and his even more shocking assassination. Let's rewind to the year 37 CE. Rome is buzzing with excitement. The beloved emperor Tiberius is dead, and his great-nephew, the young and popular Germanicus's son, Caligula, is about to take the throne. The people are ecstatic. They parade through the streets, celebrating the end of Tiberius's gloomy reign and welcoming what they believe will be a golden age. And for the first few months, it seems like they were right. Caligula starts off as a model ruler. He gives bonuses to the military, abolishes unfair taxes, and frees citizens who were unjustly imprisoned. He even stages lavish games and spectacles for the public, earning him the love and adoration of the Roman people. It felt like a dream come true, but this dream was about to turn into a terrifying nightmare. Just 7 months into his reign, Caligula falls gravely ill. We don't know exactly what it was. Some historians suggest epilepsy, others a severe fever or even a nervous breakdown. Whatever they cause, when he recovers, he is a changed man. The benevolent, popular emperor is gone, replaced by a paranoid, cruel, and erratic tyrant. This is where the stories of his legendary madness begin. He starts spending money recklessly, throwing extravagant parties, and embarking on massive, pointless building projects that drain the Roman treasury. He builds a 2-mile floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, just so he can ride his horse across it, simply to prove a prophecy wrong. His cruelty becomes legendary. He's said to have had people executed for the smallest of offenses, or sometimes for no reason at all. There are accounts of him forcing senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, and even using prisoners as food for his wild animals when he ran out of meat. He becomes obsessed with his own divinity, demanding that his statues be placed in temples and that people worship him as a living god. Neos Helios, the new sun. This was a massive insult to Roman tradition and religious beliefs. And of course, there's the most famous story of all. His beloved horse. The tale goes that he gave the horse a marble stable, a jewel-encrusted collar, and even planned to appoint him as a consul, the highest office in Rome. While this was likely a satirical gesture to mock the senators he despised, it perfectly illustrates his contempt for the Roman establishment and his increasingly bizarre behavior. As Caligula's tyranny grew, so did the fear and resentment among Rome's elite. The senators, who he openly humiliated and terrorized, began to plot against him. The Praetorian Guard, his own personal bodyguards, also grew tired of his erratic commands and insults. They saw him not as a divine ruler, but as a dangerous liability who threatened the stability of the entire empire. The whispers in the shadowy corridors of the palace grew louder. A conspiracy was forming, led by a high-ranking Praetorian officer named Cassius Chaerea, a man whom Caligula constantly mocked for his high-pitched voice. The stage was set for a dramatic and violent end to this reign of terror. The final act took place on a cold January day in the year 41 CE. Caligula was attending a series of games and theatrical performances held in honor of the divine Augustus. During a break, he decided to leave the crowded theater and head to his private baths. He took a shortcut through a narrow, secluded hallway within the palace. It was a fatal mistake. As he walked, the conspirators made their move. Cassius Chaerea, along with other members of the Praetorian Guard, cornered him. Chaerea reportedly struck the first blow, with others quickly joining in. The emperor, who had ruled through fear, now faced his own. Caligula tried to call for help, but the attack was swift, brutal, and final. He was stabbed over 30 times. But the conspirators' bloody work wasn't finished. To ensure that Caligula's lineage could never return to power, they rushed to the Imperial palace and murdered his wife, Milonia Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. The image of the baby-ass head being smashed against a wall is one of the most chilling details of this brutal coup. With the emperor and his family dead, chaos erupted in Rome. The Senate, sensing an opportunity, tried to restore the Republic and erase Caligula from history. They ordered his statues to be torn down and his name to be chiseled off public monuments, a practice known as damnatio memoriae. They wanted Rome to forget that the monster Caligula had ever existed. But history does not forget, and the Praetorian Guard had other plans. They had no interest in restoring the old Republic. They wanted an emperor they could control. While senators debated, the guards were ransacking the palace. Hiding behind a curtain, they found a terrified man, cowering in fear. It was Caligula's uncle, Claudius. Thinking he was about to be killed, he begged for his life. But instead of killing him, the guards proclaimed him the new emperor. The assassination of Caligula didn't lead to freedom. It simply replaced one emperor with another and cemented the Praetorian Guard's power as kingmakers in the Roman Empire. So, was Caligula truly insane? It's a question historians still debate. Many of the most shocking stories about him come from sources written long after his death by authors who were hostile to the imperial system, like Suetonius and Cassius Dio. They may have exaggerated or even invented tales to portray him as the ultimate tyrant. Perhaps his actions weren't madness, but a calculated, albeit brutal, attempt to consolidate his power and break the influence of the old Roman aristocracy. Or maybe the absolute power he held simply corrupted him absolutely, driving a young and promising ruler to become a paranoid despot. The truth is likely a mix of all these things. He was probably a deeply flawed man, traumatized by a brutal childhood where he saw most of his family murdered, who was then handed absolute power at a young age. His early illness may have genuinely affected his mental state, amplifying his paranoia and cruelty. But whatever the cause, his 4-year reign left an indelible scar on Roman history. It served as a terrifying cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the thin line between a ruler and a monster. Caligula's story, a whirlwind of hope, terror, and blood, reminds us that even the most powerful empires can be brought to their knees by the madness of a single man. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the chaotic reign of Caligula. What do you think? Was he a madman or a victim of historical slander? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey back to ancient Rome, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from history. We'll see you in the next video. The name Caligula conjures images of madness, cruelty, and unchecked power. A Roman emperor who declared his horse a consul, married his own sisters, and demanded to be worshipped as a living god. For 2,000 years, he's been the poster child for a tyrannical insanity. But is that the whole story? How did a beloved young prince, hailed as a star by the Roman people, become one of history's most infamous villains? The story of Caligula is more than just a list of shocking acts. It's a dark, twisted journey into the heart of absolute power. A cautionary tale about what happens when one man holds the fate of an empire in his hands, and his mind begins to fracture. To understand Imancio, we have to first understand the boy. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula, or Little Boot by his father's soldiers, was born into the most powerful family in the world. He was the son of Germanicus, a military hero and the people's champion, and the great-grandson of the first emperor, Augustus. His childhood was spent on the rugged frontiers of the empire, surrounded by legions who adored him. To the Roman people, he wasn't just royalty. He was a symbol of hope, the heir to a golden legacy. But this idyllic picture was a fragile illusion, soon to be shattered by the brutal politics of Rome. The reigning emperor, Tiberius, was a grim and paranoid ruler. He saw Germanicus's popularity as a threat. When Caligula was just a boy, his father died under mysterious circumstances in Syria, widely believed to have been poisoned on Tiberius's orders. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. One by one, Caligula watched as his family was destroyed. His mother, Agrippina, and his two older brothers were arrested, exiled, and eventually starved to death. By the emperor's command, young Caligula was spared, but he was summoned to the island of Capri to live under the watchful eye of the man who had murdered his family. Imagine being a teenager, living in a gilded cage with your family's killer. For years, Caligula survived in this viper's nest. He had to hide his grief, mask his anger, and play the part of a loyal, unassuming ward. The ancient historian Suetonius wrote that Caligula became a master actor, concealing his savage and inhuman nature beneath a flawless performance of obedience. He witnessed firsthand the paranoia, cruelty, and debauchery of Tiberius's court. This was his education in power not a lesson in justice or governance, but in fear, survival, and the absolute authority of the emperor to kill, torture, and destroy on a whim. The trauma of these years planted a seed of darkness that would later grow into a forest of paranoia. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the Senate and the people of Rome rejoiced. They bypassed Tiberius's own grandson and proclaimed the 24-year-old Caligula as the sole emperor. It was a moment of incredible optimism. Crowds cheered his name, calling him our baby and our star. The dark days of Tiberius were over. Caligula began his reign with promise. He gave bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, pardoned political prisoners, and staged lavish games for the public. He seemed to be the generous, benevolent ruler everyone had hoped for, the true son of his beloved father, Germanicus. For 7 months, Rome experienced a brief, golden autumn, and then everything changed. Caligula fell gravely ill. For weeks, he lingered on the brink of death, and the entire empire held its breath. When he finally recovered, he was a different man. The cheerful, generous prince was gone. In his place was a suspicious, irritable, and terrifying tyrant. Historians have debated the cause for centuries. Was it a physical illness, like encephalitis, that caused brain damage? Was it a mental breakdown, the delayed eruption of years of suppressed trauma and paranoia? Or did his brush with death, combined with the intoxicating taste of absolute power, simply shatter his sanity? Whatever the cause, the good Caligula was gone forever. The reign of terror had begun. His first acts were driven by a deep-seated paranoia. He turned on those closest to him, the very people who had supported his rise to power. He forced his father-in-law to take his own life. He executed the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Macro, who had been his staunchest ally. He even executed his cousin and co-heir Gemellus, the grandson of Tiberius. No one was safe. He instituted treason trials, not to seek justice, but to eliminate perceived threats and, more importantly, to seize their fortunes. The treasury, which had been full when he took power, was quickly drained by his extravagant spending on palaces, yachts, and games. The treason trials became a gruesome but effective fundraising method. His cruelty became legendary. He was said to take pleasure in watching tortures and executions, often prolonging the suffering of his victims. He famously wished that the Roman people had a single neck, so he could sever it with one blow. He began to blur the lines between man and God. He built temples to himself and demanded that he be worshipped as a living deity, a direct violation of Roman tradition. He would appear in public dressed as various gods: Jupiter, Neptune, even Venus. He had the heads of famous statues of gods replaced with his own likeness. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a profound and blasphemous break from a cornerstone of Roman identity, which held that only deceased emperors could be deified. And then there are the stories that have cemented his reputation for insanity. Did he really appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, to the position of consul? The historian Cassius Dio says he promised to, but it's more likely this was a satirical gesture, a way of showing the senators that his horse was more worthy of office than they were. It was a joke, but a terrifying one, demonstrating his absolute contempt for the Roman elite. What about his supposed incestuous relationships with his sisters, especially his favorite, Drusilla? Roman sources are adamant about this, portraying it as the ultimate sign of his moral decay. But these accounts were written by his enemies, members of the senatorial class It's possible these rumors were slandered, designed to posthumously justify his assassination by painting him as an unnatural monster. Another infamous story tells of his planned invasion of Britain. After marching the legions all the way to the English Channel, he supposedly ordered them to halt in Caligula seashells. He called them the spoils of the ocean and carried them back to Rome in a mock triumph. Was this a sign of a madman? Or was it a calculated act of humiliation against his own soldiers, a punishment for some unrecorded mutiny or disobedience? With Caligula, the line between madness and a terrifying, deliberate cruelty is impossibly thin. His actions were designed to instill fear, to show everyone, from the highest senator to the lowest soldier, that he was bound by no laws, no traditions, and no logic but his own. The system of power in Rome was a delicate balance. The emperor held supreme authority, but he was expected to rule with respect for the Senate and Roman traditions. Caligula shattered that balance. He openly mocked the senators, seized their property, and slept with their wives. He ruled not through consensus or respect, but through pure, unadulterated fear. For nearly 4 years, the most powerful men in Rome lived in constant terror. They knew that a wrong word, a misplaced glance, or a simple rumor could lead to their immediate and brutal execution. This couldn't last. The fear he had so carefully cultivated would ultimately be his undoing. In January of 41 AD, a conspiracy finally took shape. The plotters weren't just disgruntled senators. They included officers of his own personal bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, led by a man named Cassius. Caligula had repeatedly insulted Sharia, mocking his voice and his manhood. On the 24th of January, as Caligula was leaving a theater performance, the assassins cornered him in a secluded corridor. Sharia struck the first blow, and the others swarmed in, stabbing him over 30 times. Their rage was so intense that they didn't stop there. They found his wife, Casonia, and his infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, and murdered them as well, brutally smashing the baby's head against a wall to extinguish Caligula's bloodline completely. The image of Caligula that we have today is a tapestry woven from fact, rumor, and propaganda. The senators who survived him had every reason to exaggerate his crimes to justify their role in his murder. Later historians, like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, wrote their accounts decades later. Relying on these hostile sources, they painted a picture of a deranged monster, and that is the image that is stuck. But the real story of Caligula is not just about a mad emperor. It is about a system that allowed one man to accumulate so much power that there were no checks, no balances, and no escapee. It is the story of a boy broken by trauma, who grew into a man convinced that the only way to be safe was to make everyone else terrified. He was a product of the very system he came to dominate. His legacy is a chilling reminder that absolute power doesn't just corrupt. It can utterly destroy the human mind. The fall of Caligula wasn't just the end of a tyrant. It was a warning that echoes through history, a warning about the darkness that can grow inside a single man when he is raised above all others, and the terrifying consequences for the world he rules. Thank you for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic tales of the Roman Empire, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most compelling stories. See you next time.